Yeah, Nathan, if you'd like to go ahead and introduce yourself, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you so much for giving me the platform to discuss this with you and the members. Really appreciate having this space. I think if I go I'll get to this slide first because this is my introduction. So my name is Nathan Chadwick. I am a strategy lead for worldwide clinical trials, focusing on rare diseases with a particular subspecialty in Huntington's disease. So I am part of what's known as a contract research organization or a CRO. And what we ultimately do is we help the drug development companies to try and facilitate the research. So they're the scientists who create these molecules and these drugs, but they don't necessarily have the operational expertise nor the infrastructure to run the clinical trials. And that's where companies like mine come in to support that facilitation. I've been doing this now for actually nearly 15 years, and I've held a number of different roles through a number of different organizations. I'm a psychologist by training, and one of my particular passions is patient advocacy, especially when it comes to rare diseases, to make sure that we put the patient voice out there. I've been actively involved in the HD space since about 2020. I've ran a number of Huntington's trials, large global trials, including trials in the UK. So I know a lot of the UK doctors very well. I was at EHDM back in 2022. I couldn't make last year's meeting because I had a wedding that I needed to attend. It wasn't my own, but my wife reliably informed me that if I didn't attend, it might end badly. So unfortunately, wasn't able to go to Strasbourg last year, but we'll be going to the HSG event in Nashville later on this year. So today, the purpose really is I want to give a bit of a history of clinical trials and how we got to where we are today with all of the tools available to us and also the breadth of clinical trials. As I've already mentioned, things like CRO. We use a lot of jargon in this industry, and sometimes patients don't understand that jargon. And so I'm hoping to do a bit of a jargon busting. And I'm going to give you a bit of a history of clinical trials and an overview of the type of trials, including the different phases and what we try and do in those different phases. And then I'm going to go over what's currently available in Huntington's disease. End up with a bit of hopes for the future in Huntington's for clinical trials and then for the medicines. And then if we have enough time at the end, open it up to the floor for anyone who has any questions. I do have to put a little bit of a disclaimer on there. I am not a medical professional, so this is not intended to substitute any information that you or the people that you support may have received from their medical professional. And all of what I share my own opinions and are not reflective of the company. So before I start, I want to go over rare disease. So Huntington's is classified as a rare disease. There are, for those who don't know, different classifications depending on where you live. So in the US, they use a certain classification. In Japan and China, they use a certain one. And here in Europe, we use a different one. But there are now over 10,000 registered rare diseases. Like Huntington's, 80% of these diseases have a genetic origin. And it's estimated that there are 36 million Europeans that are living with a rare disease. 70% of these start in childhood, and unfortunately, 95% of them still don't have an approved treatment. And what we see with a lot of patients in rare diseases is they go through what we call a diagnostic odyssey. And the average time to get diagnosed with a rare disease is about 5 years. Sometimes it's even greater for different diseases. And one last one, which I think really hits home, despite the lack of attention that rare diseases sometimes get, is globally, rare diseases impact more people than cancer and AIDS combined, which are obviously two very well-known diseases. And so I want to go over a little bit of a history of clinical trials and how we are where we are today with all of the knowledge and all of the rules and regulations which govern what we do. And so I can be quite proud as a British person because a good number of these discoveries were founded here in the UK. So to look at the first clinical trial, this is often accredited to a British naval surgeon. He was actually a Scottish guy by the name of James Lind, who completed the first randomized controlled trial. And what he was looking into was sailors who had scurvy. And he had 12 sailors. He split them up into 6 groups of 2, and he gave different medications, quote unquote medications, to them. Some he gave seawater to, some he gave one of the kind of medicines that was available on boats at the time. But importantly, 2 of them he gave oranges and lemons to. And it was those 2 by the end of his investigation he found, recovered. And actually they recovered so well that they were actually able to help in nursing the other ones which hadn't done. It took about 50 years until someone did something with this. 50 years later, the Navy actually started to make lemons part of a sailor's diet. And then they actually changed it to limes because at the time they were a little bit cheaper. Moving forward a little bit, obviously placebo controlling, and I'll talk about what a placebo is shortly for those who may not know. That was first used in 1863 by a US doctor. Who was looking to try and test a drug for infection. Ultimately, what he found was that this drug that was very commonly given actually showed that it did no better than the placebo. And so what he told his peers is there is no point in us giving this drug out because this is going to naturally resolve anyway. And he did that by finding that out via placebo controlling. And moving forward, and this now starts to get into the groundbreaking and the foundation of why we do what we do today. So there was a sulfur craze back in 1937. This was over in America. These drugs, the sulfonamides, were used as antiviral antibiotics. And there was a number of different companies that were creating and generating them. Unfortunately, over 100 people died because of poor manufacturing. And so the government over there, the Food and Drug Administration, it was called something slightly different back then, they made a legislation to make sure that manufacturers actually had to test their drugs toxicologically to make sure that they were safe. And that is now a foundation of what we do. And you'll see that kind of stage as I move through the slides and the different phases of research. Switching back over to the UK, the MRC in 1946, which is the Medical Research Council here in the United Kingdom, they approved the first randomized controlled trial of streptomycin. So this, although it was kind of done previously way back in 1747 by James Lind, this was the first time it was done properly under the guidelines similar to how we do it today. About a year later, we start to get into medical and research ethics. And so because of all of the war crimes that the German physicians kind of did during World War II, after the war, we developed the Nuremberg Code. And this is a set of 10 guidances on ethics when completing research in human subjects, which includes, they must know and they must consent to the trial. They must understand what's going to happen to them before they actually take part. Roll forward a couple of years, we then have the Declaration of Helsinki, which was signed and penned in 1964. So this really expands on the Nuremberg Code and again sets that global, so everybody uses this still to this day. We still follow the Nuremberg Code and the Declaration of Helsinki. And this is something that is used worldwide as a way of making sure that everybody is protecting the rights of subjects and patients. And then present-ish day, the last kind of big movement in clinical trials was the International College of Harmonization. They created a guidance called GCP, known as Good Clinical Practice. This is effectively, it's a Bible. It tells drug developers, it tells doctors around the world what is expected from them and what their roles and responsibilities are. So the initial version came out in 1997. There's been 2 updates since. So that was Amendment 1 and Amendment 2. Amendment 2 was relatively recent in 2016. Amendment 3 is currently under authorship, and that's actually out for public consultation at the moment. So now that we understand a little bit about the history of clinical trials, I want to move into jargon busting, and a lot of jargon. There's a lot of acronyms I mentioned, a lot of things which you may not understand, or people that you may support don't understand. So the first is a clinical trial protocol. So this is a document effectively that details everything about the study, who is running it, why they're running it, what they're going to need to run it, and who's going to be taking part. Next will be something which you may hear referred to as an investigational medicinal product. Sometimes this comes as a code, sometimes it already has a name, but effectively this is the drug that is being tested but currently has not been approved for use commercially. Placebo is basically a substance which is identical to the study drug in any way, but actually contains no active compound. So people may refer to these as sugar pills. Obviously, in Huntington's, it's not just pills. It could be an injection. And so, again, it remains exactly the same. So to the even to the trained eye, they can tell no difference between those 2 compounds. Next up is randomized, and this is a process whereby the patients are randomly allocated into different trial groups or arms. This may be done in a multitude of different fashions. You may do it 1-to-1. So for every one patient that gets the drug, another patient gets the placebo. It could be done 2-to-1. So for every 2 patients that get the drug, 1 patient gets the placebo. And it can also be done 3-to-1. In Huntington's, I've never seen them go up to 4-to-1. 3-to-1 is probably the maximum that we would look at. Double blind refers to where neither the researcher or the participant knows which arm, as I previously mentioned, they've been randomized into. Informed consent is a document which explains to the participant everything they need to know about the trial. Some trials, fortunately, are what we call open label. So if it's open label, effectively that means there is no placebo and only the drug is being tested. Adverse event is any unwarranted or harmful effect experienced during the course of the trial. And this doesn't have to be related to the drug or not. Again, going back to some of the principles, some of the foundations of research, we collect all information, regardless if it's related or not. And then last, which is really important in Huntington's, is something called orphan drug designation. So this is something which pharmaceutical companies and drug developers can apply for to the regulatory agencies, such as the Food and Drug Administration over in the US, the MHRA here in the UK, and then the European Medicines Authority that governs Europe. And this allows them certain benefits, both financial and also during regulatory review, to try and speed up the process. And as the name would suggest, with it being orphan, these are only given to companies that are looking into diseases which are classified as rare, and they currently have a high unmet need, which is obviously Huntington's disease. So a number of the drug development companies that are out there have this orphan drug designation or are in the process of applying to it. So to go into a little bit of an overview of the types of trials that are out there are 2 main types of trials. The first one is an interventional trial. So this is one where the intervention could be a drug, it could be a device, but effectively you are giving the patient something that they wouldn't have as part of their normal standard of care, and you're trying to see how well that intervention helps their disease, whether it be the chorea, whether it be the memory, whether it be cognition, whether it be mental health related. But that is the purpose of an interventional trial. An observational trial is basically where you observe a patient over a particular length of time. You can do this prospectively or retrospectively. And Enroll HD is a perfect example of this. It is the largest observational registry in Huntington's disease. Now, trials can be further broken down into different categories. So you can have treatment trials, which look to directly improve the disease, and prevention trials, which effectively look to prevent the disease from even occurring. Diagnostic trials, which look at seeing if there are ways that we can better diagnose the condition. Screening trials, which, again, as the name would suggest, look at to see if there's better ways that we can find out how people have this disease. And then quality of life trials, which, again, look into making sure that the patient has a better quality of life. So I'm going to go over the phases, and I apologize, at least on my screen, my words have all come really jumbled together. They should say phase, but in some places it looks like raise. So if that is the case on your side, I do apologize. But effectively, it starts off with preclinical, and then we use the terms phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4. Each of these phases in the process are crucial, and they try and look into a slightly different aspect each time and serve a slightly different purpose. But obviously the hope is that a company who finds compounds for Huntington's, they start out way on the left-hand side and they're able to move through all the different phases. Now, on average, it takes 10 to 20 years to move through all these phases. So from a company finding a compound that could potentially work to that drug getting to the market, it is quite a long time. Now, as I mentioned before, with things like the orphan drug designation, you may be able to pull that in and reduce that timeline down to the 10-year mark, because obviously you are able to move through the phases a little bit faster. In addition, because of that orphan drug designation, sometimes you are able to skip a phase, and the regulators will be happy for you to skip a phase. Again, there is such a high unmet need in Huntington's. The agencies that govern what we do are thankfully quite pragmatic, and they can see sometimes that, you know, there isn't a need to do this extra step because of the rarity of the condition, and also because these patients have pretty much nothing out there. A couple of other facts: for every one drug that gets to market, there have been 10,000 failures. So it takes a lot of shots to get something that works. And that's why it's really important that as a community, we encourage and get behind as many of these drug developers as possible, because it's going to take a lot of shots on goal before we actually score. And as some of you may be aware, the actual cost of doing this research is not, quantified in terms of the hundreds of pounds or the thousands or even the millions. Likely it is billions and billions of pounds that it costs these companies to take it through all these specific steps. So now moving into the different phases. So preclinical testing is something which is done before we even start to give it to patients. This part is usually done 2 to 3 years before we start to test it in human volunteers as well. It can be done in vitro or in vivo. So in vitro is test tubes and in vivo is animals. And effectively, it helps us to understand how safe is this drug. And we can also use certain animal models to look at any potential efficacy. And so I'll talk about efficacy first. So these animal models, what they'll do is they will give rats mostly in HD, but sometimes dogs and other animals as well. They'll give them the HD gene, and they will provide them the drug, and they have very specific animal model tests to see if this works as we would expect it to work in a patient. And so if it's a career drug, they'll look at movement over time of the rat, involuntary movement, and see if that involuntary movement is reduced over time. And that is when they'll say, this drug looks like it can work. We would be happy to move this on to the next phase. But we can't do that without making sure that it's safe. And so we look at safety in terms of what organ systems does it effect. So specific classes and types of drug will affect different organ systems, such as the liver and the kidneys, and the stomach as well. These are common places where drugs are broken down by our bodies. And so we'll look to see, is it doing anything there that we wouldn't want it to do? And so they'll look at blood tests, they'll look at imaging. A lot of time as well, they'll perform post-mortems on these animals to really make sure that it is safe before we move it on to that next phase. And they'd look at the toxicity of this drug. The toxicity is broken down into 3 different types. So they'll do acute toxicity, where they will give a single dose and look to see what happens. And they also do something called fatal dose testing. And effectively what that does is it looks at how high of a dose do we need to go before it kills 50% of the population. And again, it sounds really cruel, but this is a way that we make sure that when it gets into humans, that these issues, these outcomes are not repeated in humans. What I will say is that they are, and we are getting better at doing more of the in vitro testing and moving away from the animal testing, as well as advancements in computers and things like AI. We're now able to do a certain proportion of this preclinical testing using computer models rather than having to do physical. We then do subacute testing. So what we do there is we will give doses over weeks or months, and we look at how the body deals with that over time. And then finally, we do something called chronic toxicity. This is arguably one of the most important toxicological tests. And effectively, that is long and repeated exposure, 6, 12, 18 months. And the chronic toxicity is what's going to drive how long you're allowed to actually do it. And so some of the frustrations I often hear from HD patients and researchers globally is, this trial's only 6 months long. I would love to be on this for longer. And a lot of the time that's down to this chronic toxicity at the bottom, in that the drug developer maybe just hasn't got to doing that long-term toxicity yet at the 12 and the 18 months, because that really shapes how long the companies and the agencies that approve the research will be comfortable in allowing us giving that into humans. So next we go into phase 1. So this is now when we go into humans, and so they are aptly called first in human studies. A lot of the times they're done in healthy volunteers. So way back when I started out in this industry, I actually used to work just at the back of Manchester Royal Infirmary in a phase 1 unit. And we used to get healthy patients, healthy volunteers in, and we used to do all of this different testing on them. This is what a lot of people think clinical trials is. It's the guinea pig trials. Now, more often than not in rare diseases, you can skip that first in human step and you can go directly into patients. Again, that's because there is a real high unmet need. And so if your animal models show good safety and preliminary efficacy, sometimes these agencies will allow you to put it into patients. They're usually very small. So sometimes they'll be done at just 1 location or maybe 2 locations. And this is globally, so 1 or 2 places globally, which often means that it is restricted to a particular country, and obviously sometimes a particular location in a particular country. The purpose of these is effectively to check the safety that we saw in the animal model or in the test tubes. Does this still carry over when we're putting it into humans or putting it into patients? There are 3 different types of, there are more, but there are 3 main types of phase 1 study. One is called a single ascending dose, and as the name would suggest, they give 1 dose of the medication. If that is safe, they then, with the next group of patients, they'll give a higher dose. With the next, they'll give a higher dose, and so on and so forth. The next type is a multiple ascending dose. Again, the name kind of tells you what it is. They'll give a number of different doses, and then they'll check to see if it's safe. And then the next group of patients, they'll go up a dose, and they'll do the same thing again. Now, what they look for in these studies is to see what the human body ultimately can tolerate. And each of these will have a very, very prescribed We call it a stopping rule. And so there'll be a series of events that if they are triggered, the trial will be stopped because it's not deemed safe. That doesn't necessarily mean that the drug's not worked. It just means that that level, the dose, the amount of medication that we're giving is too much, and they'll go down to the prior dose. And what we're looking for here is we're looking for a dose which is safe in humans, but then also actually shows some effect. So it's a fine balance of the two. It's not just give as much drug as you want, because obviously that can have significant effects on the body. Lastly, we do a food effect study. So we actually look at if it's a pill, if it's an oral medication, and also if it's given intravenously or intrathecally. We'll look at how this drug interacts with food, because drugs, like food, need to be metabolized and broken down. Interesting little story. When I was on my research centre that I mentioned in Manchester, I did a food effect study, and it was written into the protocol that we had to give them a quarter-pounder cheeseburger from McDonald's with chips and a milkshake. So part of my job every day was to go to McDonald's and get these healthy volunteers a quarter-pounder cheeseburger. Now, the next stage is phase 2. So if everything has gone well in phase 1, and if we see safety, then the company will look to progress it into the next stage. These are larger scale trials, which are done in patients. There's no phase 2 studies out there which will be done in healthy volunteers, although some may have a healthy volunteer comparator arm, but they will be done in patients. These can be around 50 to 100, 200 people. Again, it completely depends on the nature of the drug and what they're looking to investigate. In most instances, the phase 2 studies will be done across multiple sites and multiple countries, and almost always will be randomized against a placebo, although in some instances in Huntington's, it will be open label. Unicure is a great example of that. The purpose of phase 2 primarily is safety, but now researchers will really start to dive into the efficacy more. And so this sub-testing will allow them to select the right dose, to select the right patient, and also to select the right tests. This is really important because the next phase is phase 3. So phase 3 are very large studies, even in Huntington's disease, which is classified as rare. These are going to be 200 plus patients. And some of the HD studies that have been out there in the past have recruited 600 to 800 patients, as I'm sure you're aware. But this is still very different from other diseases like cancer, like diabetes, like obesity, like cough, where we see thousands of patients being recruited. The phase 3 trials are often called registrational or pivotal trials, because these trials are what the drug development companies will go to the agency with their set of data at the end of that trial to effectively say, we think our drug works. Here is our data to support that. Ultimately, please, can you approve it? These trials can compare drug to a placebo, or they can compare it to the standard of care treatment. As there is no standard of care treatment currently in Huntington's disease, almost all of the phase 3 trials that are out there will be comparing their drug against the placebo. And because they are now starting to think about getting this drug approved and putting it out to patients, we'll also start to see a lot of quality of life assessments, which are used as well. Now, I've mentioned the regulators, they're called out here. This is not all inclusive. There are other regulators out there, such as the PMDA over in Japan. China has a specific regulator. Australia has a specific regulator. But the common ones that you'll hear when talking about Huntington's research are the FDA, which is the US, the EMA, which is Europe, and then the MHRA, which is UK. The MHRA used to be a subdivision of the EMA, but since Brexit, and I don't like talking about that, the MHRA has now peeled themselves away. And so they are self-governing, and they have authority over what they are happy to approve and what they're not. Now, one of the frustrations in Huntington's disease is, and I'll come on to this a little bit later on in the presentation, is these regulators prescribe to the drug development companies, by extension the CRO, and by extension the doctors and the patients, what tests to use. Because they have these divisions, they have all these clever people, and they will pick the assessments which they think are the ones which show if the drug works or not. And so that is a particular challenge in Huntington's disease at the minute, based on what the regulatory agencies ultimately will be happy to select. And again, as I mentioned, I'll talk about that a little bit later on. Now, one important thing to note here is that the patient population, so the stage of the patient and where they're currently at with their Huntington's disease, and the dose that has been chosen in their phase 3 will be what is given on the label. And when I say the label, if any of you are on any medication that you can get either prescribed or over the counter, it'll come with a leaflet. It'll tell you how much drug is in that, 5 milligrams, 10 milligrams, 20 milligrams, and it will tell you what this should be used for, what conditions this should be used for. And the phase 3 trial, that will prescribe that. So if they've only done it in a very specific set of patients with Huntington's, and they've only done it at one dose, that is what they will get their approval on. And I think this is really important for organizations such as yourselves to know, especially if you're providing advice, is just because there is a company that is out there looking into Huntington's doesn't necessarily mean that the patients will be able to get it, dependent on what the label is. So the next phase of research is phase 4. This is often called post-market research. And effectively, the purpose of this is to support market uptake of drugs. And again, we can split this out into multiple different types of phase 4 research. I have called out the NHS, unfortunately. The NHS is governed by an institute called NICE, which is the National Institute of Clinical Excellence. Despite the MHRA saying a drug is safe and can be used in patients, it still has to go to this organization, to NICE, that effectively see if it can be reimbursed and provided under our healthcare framework, the NHS. And so what a lot of companies do is they will conduct these large-scale trials looking at their drug over time to try and ultimately give organizations like NICE and other organizations that are out there, certainly across Europe, the information they need to give them the comfort level to approve this drug. They may look at its effectiveness if there is a comparator drug. So obviously now for chorea in Huntington's, there are a number of different options that can be prescribed to patients. And so if another company comes along with a chorea drug, what they may do after it's approved is they actually may look at it compared to those other drugs and see how well it performs, and also see if the patients have a preference. So if their quality of life is better with one drug over another. Sometimes, and I think this will be the case for Unicure, who I'll go on to mention towards the end of the presentation. Sometimes drug developers provide approvals. Sometimes agencies and regulators provide approvals to drug developers based on a very, very small number of patients. And often in those cases, what they do is they make them do safety studies for long-term use. And this is really important in genetic medicines, which obviously are really kind of key in Huntington's, given the nature of the disease. But because these genetic medicines obviously alter sometimes your structure of your DNA and alter how your body processes the proteins that they're made out of it, we like to see how that's doing 10 years down the line, 15 years down the line, 30 years down the line. Also, these drug developers can use this to what's known as a label expansion. So as I mentioned previously, if they have only done their phase 3 research in a very specific subset of patients, they can try and use a drug once it's marketed to try and get it into other indications, or to allow them to include more patients in their current life. So I wanted to, now that you know, hopefully, about the history of clinical trials and about the different phases and what's done in those phases, I wanted to talk to you about what you can expect if you join a clinical trial. And so there are very distinct parts of them. So the first part is what we call pre-screening. And this is where often, without you knowing, the doctor or nurse will look at your medical records and see if you are eligible to join the trial. What will then happen, they'll either phone you up or at your next visit, they will ask you, are you interested in doing this research? They will give you the informed consent document, which, as I mentioned previously, is usually a big, long old document, 30, 40 pages, and it tells you all about the drug, all about why we think it works, how safe it is, and what's going to happen to you during the course of the trial. And then from that, and once you've been given appropriate amount of time to read and understand it, they'll ask you to sign it and to consent to taking part. The one thing that I always encourage patients and encourage advocacy groups to encourage their patients is, at this stage, ask questions. Please don't feel like you need to agree to do the trial when you're sat there in the room with the doctor or the nurse. It's absolutely okay to take it home, to think it over, and to come armed next time with as many questions to alleviate all your concerns before you actually sign on the dotted line. Now, just because you sign on the dotted line doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to get into the trial. And so then you move into the screening phase. So this phase will look at what we call the inclusion and exclusion criteria. So it looks as, number one, do you have Huntington's disease? And then it'll look into different medications that you're on. And usually within Huntington's, there are specific cutoffs for certain scales and certain assessments. So a lot of these ask for MRIs to make sure that we're excluding any other neurological diseases. And most of the trials that are out there in Huntington's at the minute are looking for a very specific set of patients. These patients are patients where the disease has already manifested, but it hasn't manifested to the point where independence has now been reduced. So most trials are all looking for that same very specific patient population. If you are eligible and if you pass all your screening tests, you'll then be enrolled in the treatment phase. Usually, Huntington's trials are on average between 12 months and 18 months. Some are a little bit shorter, but on average, that's kind of what we see across all the companies that are currently looking into it. And again, on average, they ask patients to come in once every other month, sorry. So every 2 months is usually the time frame that they ask. There may be certain trials where there is a bigger lift at the start, and so patients need to come in maybe 5 times during the first 2 to 3 months, but then it spaces out. They will be informed when the drug is going to stop and when they are no longer going to be able to take that drug. And once they stop taking that drug, they are not out of the trial yet. They are followed up for a specific amount of time. So that follow-up is prescribed again by all of that preclinical drug testing that we've done, as well as all of the clinical testing in humans. And we, the drug developers, they deem what is safe and how long we need to follow up to make sure that there's no drug left in the system. And so they're safe then to go out into the wild world, so to speak. So this again can vary for oral compounds. So some of the oral compounds that are out there, which you may have heard of in research at the minute. So PTC 518, that is a oral small molecule looking at lowering mutant huntingtin. The follow-up for that will be about a month because it is an oral pill and it's digested by the body relatively quickly. Unicure's drug, AMT-130, this is what's known as an adeno-associated virus, or AAV, and they use this as a way to deliver their gene therapy. Now, the regulators that I previously mentioned, they mandate that you have to follow any patient that has had an AAV gene therapy or any other type of gene therapy for at least 5 years after they stop taking it. There are even instances where we have to follow up patients for longer. So there is a type of drug called a CAR-T, chimeric antigen receptor. This is often used in oncology. There are a number of CAR-T medications that are currently available in the NHS. In a clinical trial setting, if you give someone a CAR-T medication, you actually have to follow them up for 15 years, 5 years after they have stopped taking the drug. So I'm right on time to leave some time for questions at the end, which is good, because I know it was a lot to pack in and a lot of information, but I promise I'll shut up soon and you'll all be able to ask as many questions as you like. So this is currently the Huntington's clinical trial landscape. This actually isn't all inclusive because I think if I would have included everybody, we'd have probably ended up with 3 or 4 slides, because there's a lot of companies out there that are at that preclinical stage, just getting ready to switch over into humans. But I think, as an advocacy organization who tries to help patients, and if there are any patients on the phone right now, I think what I would say is this is a very, very exciting time for research in Huntington's. There is a lot that is going on globally. Obviously, in the UK at the minute, there isn't too much going on, but we're hoping that's going to change with other companies that are out there with announced trials that should be coming out this year, such as Wave. They have a what's called an antisense oligonucleotide. So this is delivered intrathecally, and what it enables the drug to do is, rather than changing your genes, it actually gets involved when your genes are trying to transcribe the protein, and it gets in at that phase and stops the bad transcription for mutant Huntington, and then that, they hope, is going to stop the Huntington's progressing. Skyhawk are another one that are coming in. They've got a planned trial this year. That's going to be an oral compound, very, very similar to PTC 518, as well as a host of other companies that you can obviously see out there. I've not mentioned Roche and Unicure yet because I have a slide there next. So, hopes for the future. So as I mentioned, it's a real exciting time for Huntington's right now, with a lot of research in the works, but also there are a lot of companies that are finally at the end goal. And as a full treatment for Huntington's, not just treating the chorea, not just treating the cognition, not just treating the kind of psychiatric mental health side of things, as you are all keenly aware, there is nothing. There is no approved treatment out there to treat Huntington's disease as a global disease. But Prelenia with prodopidine, they completed Proof HD last year. Although it failed to meet the primary endpoint, so as I previously mentioned, they didn't show to the regulators that the drug reduced the scores that they were looking for. They did find, when they did certain analyses, when they took away patients who were taking neuroleptics and chorea medications, they did see significant improvement. And so they have submitted approval to the EMA, to the European Medicines Authority, and the expected approval could come this year. So we don't know what they're going to do, but that drug could be approved this year. Now, once it gets approved, it still has to go through the process whereby the individual countries see if they are happy ultimately to pay for that medication, and in our case, give it on the NHS. But that is something that is there. For anyone involved in the community, you've probably heard of Roche and Generation HD1. Generation HD2 has now completed its enrollment, and so they have enough patients in that second trial to now, we hope, again, go to the regulators and try and get their approval. A couple of things of note: although the trial is completed, because of the type of drug, this is a antisense oligonucleotide, and they're giving this drug regularly over a period of time. They have now all their patients, but it's going to take them until the end of next year for that trial to complete. It'll take them a couple of extra months to get all that data packaged together, and so we would imagine in 2027, if the data is as good as Roche suggest, they will be able to, again, to go and submit that to the relevant authorities. One of the things that I wanted to mention is Roche are also collaborating with CHDI, who I'm sure you're all aware of, Cure Huntington's Disease Initiative, to try and understand one of the proteins which is key in Huntington's, called neurofilament light, or NFL, in greater detail. And I explain why that's important now that I come on to the next one, which is Unicure. So Unicure have a drug which is a gene therapy. As I mentioned before, it's called an adeno-associated virus. It's an AAV. That word virus often scares people, but because they inject this gene therapy into the brain, if they did it directly, the brain and the body would just eat that up and it would not allow it to get where they need to. And so all these clever scientists that I previously mentioned a couple of years ago when gene therapy started to become really kind of the trend, they worked out that if you encapsulate this gene therapy and this specific strand of DNA in a virus like a common cold, it's very similar to the theory behind all the COVID vaccines. If you can encapsulate it in that virus, you can deliver it in the body, and then the body won't attack it, and then it will be able to be delivered. And again, we hope that that's going to be efficacious. Now, really exciting news which came out at the back end of last year is Unicure went initially to the American agency, which is the Food and Drug Administration, and they have given them approval to submit this under the Regenerative Medicine Advanced Therapy designation. I told you we love acronyms. We call this RMAT. And effectively, again, like the orphan drug designation, this gives them effectively, if anyone's ever been to the famous theme park here in the UK, Alton Towers, you buy the fast track pass, right? This is effectively what they have bought by getting that RMAT. They are able to cut specific regulatory hurdles, and the aim is there that we get these medicines which are shown to be effective to market and ultimately to patients quicker. Really interestingly, so because this is a intracerebral ventricular administration, which is a bit of a mouthful to say, so they deliver this via open brain surgery. Obviously, it's very difficult to get a lot of patients who are happy to have open brain surgery. And also, it's really and even more difficult to do what we call a sham surgery. So this is effectively having a patient who is randomized, and instead of getting this treatment, they have a fake surgery. So for all intents and purposes, they effectively see on a screen what they think is their brain with the brain surgery, but it's not actually happening. And so because of that, they have actually agreed that they're going to use observational research from a natural history control to help them prove that their drug works against effectively that natural history study. And then finally, PTC/Novartis. So I called this PTC 518. It's now got a name. It's Votoplam. So PTC published their rather impressive phase 2 results again towards the probably middle of last year, actually. And because of that, Novartis stuck their hand in their pockets and paid a pricely couple of hundreds of millions, and they have bought this from PTC. Now, I don't necessarily think this is a bad thing. PTC are a small biotech company. Novartis are a household name with breadth and reach and finances. And so my hope here is that Novartis can really help accelerate the development of Votoplam. And like Prolenia have done, like Roche and Unicure are hopefully going to do as well, get this drug to market. Now, just super quick, because I do want to leave a couple of minutes at the end for questions. My hope for the future is that we are able to get more easily administered drugs and efficacious drugs. Roche's drug is given intrathecally, directly into the spine. Unicure's drug is a brain surgery. The NHS are going to struggle to approve those drugs, but also provide those drugs as well, especially with the brain surgery. The brain surgery is only going to be able to be done at a number of centres in the UK. And because of the burden and because of the complexity, there are only few centres that can actually have a drug delivered directly into the spine, which is Roche's case with tominersen. My other big hope is for years, and even still now today, we have to show the FDA, the MHRA, the EMA, that the drug works against an endpoint called the total functional capacity, which is part of the UHDRS, or Unified Huntington's Disease Rating Scale. This subsection is in my opinion, horrible assessment that is very subjective, and I don't think it is very sensitive, as in I don't think it represents the disease as a whole. which is why when I mentioned Roche collaborating to understand neurofilament light, Unicure again have done that neurofilament light, and they've got approval to look at the composite UHDRS. We're getting a more global picture of the disease, and hopefully, my hope is if these two companies set the precedent and are able to get approvals based off that, the regulators will change their opinions, and this ultimately means that drug development companies will more easily be able to get their products approved and get them to patients, which is what we all want. And with that, and I've got 5 minutes left, so I think I ended just when I wanted to. That's the end of my presentation. Before I open it up for questions, I would just like to thank Ruth and the rest of the Huntington's Disease Association for giving me this platform to speak to you all. I hope you've all learned something today. And with that, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to fire them out.
Thank you so much, Nathan. A lot to take in, but really, really useful.